Hi gang, out in the darkness of the void lurk enemies unknown even to the Imperium of Man. Isolated Xenos empires, strange human colonists, weird areas of warp crossover, but also those enemies that are simply forgotten. The product of the Imperium's ceaseless warfare and uncaring power structures, renegades from its rule hide out in the hidden areas of the galaxy. Mysteries few in the Imperium would choose to unearth again, and many of those are mysteries in the lore too. So today, let's attempt to piece one together and reconstruct the story of one of the oldest renegade space marine chapters, I guess, of the universe. The story of the Ashen Claws. And before we start, did you know that there is now merch? You can pick up some questionable Imperial vestments in the store. There's a link in the description below, or more info at the end of this video. The Ashen Claws are an example of something that has plagued the Imperium of Man since the earliest days of the Horus Heresy. Renegade Adeptus Astartes. There are many reasons Space Marine chapters turn renegade, from persecution from other Imperial factions to the common cause of being corrupted by the forces of chaos, but the Ashen Claws are one of the few who are neither of those. Loyal only to their brethren, the Ashen Claws are an independent chapter of piratical Astartes based in the Atagatis system in the benighted ghoul stars of the northeastern galactic fringe. Their actions and combat record is predicated on little more than survival, the perpetuation of the chapter as an independent force, and this is a creed the Ashen Claws have lived by for over 10 millennia, their status as rebels predating even the Horus Heresy and the creation of the slightly more common traitor Astartes. For while the Ashen Claws were once loyal Astartes in service to the Emperor, their casting aside during the days of the Great Crusade by their own Primarch led them to turn away from either the Imperium of Man or later the rebels of Horus and forge their own path, far from the reach of the Emperor's servants. The origins of the Ashen Claws are mostly lost to the Imperium of M41, but lie in the dim days of the Horus Heresy, and before that, of the Great Crusade itself. Another one of the remnants left behind by the fractured way in which the early Space Marine legions found each of their unique cultures. Like the Carcharodon Astra, presented elsewhere on this channel, the origins of the Ashen Claws lie with the early 19th Legion, the one that would later become the Raven Guard early in the Emperor's unification wars on Terra. The Raven Guard are known in the 41st millennium as a force of heroic freedom fighters, stealthy infiltrators dedicated to releasing mankind from domination by alien oppressors or by the forces of chaos, but their reputation was once very different. The early 19th Legion was formed on Terra near the end of the Emperor's unification wars. Like many of the early legions, specific Terran populations were designated as suitable cultures for that legion to draw from, and in the case of the 19th, this was to be the Xeric tribes of the Asiatic dust plains. The Xeric were an effective but callous and brutal population of nomadic tribesmen who travelled the Dust Bowl, frequently coming into conflict with the neighbouring Indonesic bloc. They initially opposed the rise of unity, and as a sort of punishment, when the tribes were eventually cowed by the Emperor, their sons were taken for indoctrination into the legions and then posted to watch over their former families. The 19th quickly became one of the Emperor's many terror weapons. Pale of skin with inky black eyes, clad in grey power armour with their faces marked by the ash of their homeland, the 19th Legion were famous for their ability to go from silent stillness to berserk fury in the blink of an eye, a deliberate tool used to cow the vast trains of captives and slaves they took from their conquests. Many of the warlords of ancient Terra would find their officer tier suddenly assassinated by unseen bolts, their troopers kept confused and disorganised until a strike force of the 19th would descend as if from nowhere to rip the heart out of their army. And afterwards, the grim 19th Legion would march the survivors deep into the Dust Bowl to be watched over in brutal concentration camps and then harvested for recruits. When the Great Crusade came, the 19th Legion, like all the legions, took their brutal tactics to the stars as the expeditionary fleet spread out from Terra in search of the lost remnants of humanity and the lost Primarchs, who had originally been the genetic template for the legions before they were lost, sucked into a warp vortex and scattered across the galaxy. Some of those Primarchs were found quickly, which allowed their legions to grow exponentially, and many of the most famous legions of the early Crusade, the Space Wolves, the Lunar Wolves, the Iron Hands, owe their success to the fact that their Primarchs were found relatively soon into it, allowing their legions to grow to a size that could spearhead the greatest expeditions. However, some legions had to fight on without their Primarch for many decades, and in this time, limited by their size, their forces would be seconded to other larger legions to serve as auxiliaries. For the early 19th, fighting without their Primarch for decades, they would most often be found alongside the Lunar Wolves, and their Primarch, Horus Lupercal. And the 16th Primarch was a great fan of the Legion's temperament and actions. The 19th Legion were famed as infiltrators and masters of the sudden brutal strike, a tactic that synergized well with the Lunar Wolves' preferred spear-tip thrust to the center of the enemy command. The frontline forces of the Lunar Wolves would be augmented by the brutal Terminators of the 19th Legion, and enemies falling back from the Imperial assault would find shadowy warriors of the 19th lying in wait, their lines of retreat cut off as the grim Astartes outflanked the enemy, ready to cart the defeated foe off into servitude to the Legion. The combined 16th and 19th also developed some tactics that utilised their particular specialisms. An example of this can be found in the mid-Crusade era Battle of Hell's Anvil. Hell's Anvil was a fortress on the world of Baratrum that had proven particularly difficult for the Imperial army of the Great Crusade to break. Baratrum was a world of vast mineral wealth and rampant tech heresy, whose population centres took the form of great underground cavern cities, fortified against ground attack and dominated by ancient overlords who enslaved their populations as mechanically augmented drones. The Imperial army forces had limited success using tunnelling machines to attack the smaller settlements, but Hell's Anvil had so far proven unassailable. That was until the 19th Legion arrived. 3 chapters of the 19th, under the command of their Legion Master, the Shade Lord Arcus Phaal, arrived along with significant Lunar Wolf support, and after appraising the situation, opted for a strategy devised by the Shade Captain of one of their chapters, Nerat Kareen. The task force lacked significant ground-based siege assets, and even if they could break the walls, the interior was swarming with drone soldiers, and so the 19th opted for a trap. They positioned their fleet directly above Hell's Anvil and commenced orbital bombardment, a strategy previously discounted by the Crusade forces because of the colossal infrastructure and civilian damage that would be caused. But that wasn't something the 19th were particularly concerned about. The tectonic force of the bombardment shook the planet to its core, causing severe damage to many of those underground cities, but crucially, turning the outer walls of Hell's Anvil into a quagmire of muddy, broken canyons and unstable ground. And into this unstable ground, Phaal ordered 3 regiments of the Therosian Voltigeurs, the Imperial army unit that had so far failed to take the fortress. In the steaming dust and acid rain of the broken ground, the Therosians attempted to build positions as the fortress emptied, hordes of drones taking the bait and rushing the army defenders. The Therosians signalled for reinforcement, for help in winning their battle, but they were met only with silence. As they died in the mud, the 19th Legion and their Lunar Wolves allies took up positions around the crater and watched. When the hordes of drones were all drawn out by the Therosians' desperate last stand, and with the tattered remains of the regiments torn to pieces, the 19th finally closed the noose and started their advance, systematically gunning down the drones in the crater as Shade Captain Kareen's chapter descended into the now thinly defended depths, eventually locating and destroying the last of the gigantic Overseer constructs and detonating the plasma reactors that powered the city. When they returned to the surface, Arcas-Fal and his allies had put the drone population to the sword, and the rest of the city-states fell soon after, and the war was hailed as a great victory. Even at that point, Nerak Karin's chapter were known as the Ashen Claws, and this tactic, the use of sacrificial units to draw out the enemy, became recorded in later years as standard practice by the 16th and 19th Legions, known again as the Ashen Claw. It's unclear which of those came first. However, though the defeat of Baratrum using the tactic of the Ashen Claw and prosecuted by the chapter of the Ashen Claws was hailed as a victory by the Imperium, it was later shunned by the Legion as a whole and repressed in the record, for the newly discovered Primarch of the 19th, Corvus Corax, had no taste for the brutal tactics of his legion. Corvus Corax was discovered on the prison moon of Deliverance, a freedom fighter who had risen up against oppression and overthrown the oppressive masters of its parent world of Kievar, and he was dismayed to be presented with his progeny. The Terran 19th were a legion of terror troops, cruel and brutal raiders with little regard for civilian casualties and a fearsome reputation amongst their allies. Imperial army regiments stationed alongside them considered it a bad omen, a death sentence, since their lives would be spent like water, the legion's sudden strike tactics frequently leaving their allies exposed and vulnerable. Their heritage as slave takers in the dust bowls of old Earth did not sit well at all with their new master, who preferred to quickly augment the legion with new recruits from Deliverance and Kievar. While some of the tactics preferred by the Terrans, particularly the use of Deliverer Terminator squads as a final decapitation strike, worked well with Corax's preferred combat doctrine, the old commanders of the Legion and their new Primarch would commonly disagree on the best way to prosecute a campaign. This came to a head during the campaign in the Akham-Sothos cluster, soon after the raising of Horus to the position of War Master. The cluster, once compliant, had fallen to a species of mind-controlling Xenos parasites known as the Unsighted Kings. Horus's plan for their downfall, that would become known as the Battle of Gate 42, involved the bulk of 4 legions: the Lunar Wolves, Iron Warriors, Space Wolves and Raven Guard, conducting a lightning frontal assault against the Bastion of the Unsighted Kings in an attempt to remove their leadership and break their control over the population. Corax raged against this idea. His was always a smaller legion, and he almost came to blows with Perturabo of the Iron Warriors over the idea of his warriors being wasted in such a way. But many of his Terran veterans agreed with their old ally, the War Master, and were eager to commit themselves to the assault. In the end, Corax was forced to relent, assigning many of those old Terran companies to the vanguard of the assault, and even leading the Forlorn Hope himself. But in the aftermath, with the Unsighted Kings cast down by Horus, Corax was furious. Thousands of Terran-born Raven Guard had given their lives to achieve the plan, reducing the Legion to only 80,000 left in active service, and Corax vowed he would never serve alongside the War Master again. In the wake of that battle, the Primarch restructured his Legion. The Terran Legionnaires were marshalled, but rather than the honours awarded those in the other legions, their muster would see them all but exiled. Paving the way for a new future, the old Terran companies, many of them veterans of the Unification Wars and the campaign in the Akham-Sothos cluster, were reorganised into a number of nomad predation fleets, a form of long-range crusading fleet, to be dispatched to the outer darkness, to the far galactic rim in the northeast of the galaxy, with orders to patrol the fated Ghoul stars and the void between galaxies to allay any potential threats to the Imperium. The Ashen Claws were to form one of those nomad fleets. Around 4,000 of the survivors of Akham-Sothos formed up aboard 13 capital ships and a score of smaller vessels. Many of them were angered at the callous disregard the Raven Lord had shown for their lives and for their record of loyal service to the Imperium, and probably also at the sidelining of their commander, the Shade Captain Nerak Karin, the brutally efficient Terran leader of the chapter, who had seen them through the fires of the Crusade Crusade and the fighting at Gate 42 was to be second in command of the fleet to a Praetor Calvus, a Deliverance-born warrior known for his loyalty to Corax. Nevertheless, the fleet set off into the Outer Dark, the final remnants of the old 19th purged and redeployed to the furthest reaches of the galaxy. And they were never recalled. Their orders never rescinded, even at the most dire point of the Horus Heresy when the Raven Guard were brought low by the massacre at Istvan V. It was only in the aftermath of the war, when the forces of the Imperium attempted to tally what had been lost, that the memory of the exiled Ashen Claws would resurface. The Nostramo sector was in the galactic northeast of the Imperium, comprising the area of space immediately around the 8th Legion homeworld of Nostramo. Even before the Horus Heresy, the 8th, the Night Lords, and their twisted Primarch, Konrad Kurz, had been all but renegades in the eyes of the Imperium. Terror troops, the Night Lords and their absolutist commander used fear to impose rigid order and discipline on their conquests, a strict black and white sense of morality cowing the populations of their worlds under the constant threat of brutal reprisal. But over the course of the Crusade, the Night Lords had only got more and more brutal, and cracks within the Legion itself grew wider as their homeworld fell back into anarchy and sent only the most brutal of murderers and gang members to serve as their new initiates. Near the start of the Heresy, the Legion had returned and destroyed its own homeworld in a fit of revenge, and by the end of the war, it was little more than a collection of warbands under various charismatic or cruel commanders, all holding on to whatever rank or title they could convincingly still claim, and waging war for resources, status, or just petty revenge. But still, despite the destruction of the traitor legions, their homeworlds were still considered major threats. Fortified systems that had held out as linchpins of the traitor cause, and during the wars of the Scouring that followed the Heresy, the Imperium mounted major campaigns to burn out the remaining traitor Astartes and recapture or destroy the planets. The whole Nostramo sector was still a Legion stronghold, ringed with defense systems, star fortresses and tributary worlds, and the Loyalist forces sent to retake it were expected to face stiff opposition from potentially tens of thousands of entrenched Night Lords, but what those forces found was nothing. In the year 17 of the 31st millennium, a few years after the end of the Heresy, 9th Legion forces from the 33rd Company, 9th chapter, made the first attempted push towards destroyed Nostramo, in particular its orbiting fortress moon, Tenebor. Tenebor was a Legion muster point, a huge fortification with guns the equal of any capital ship of the Imperium and capable of stationing over 50,000 Astartes, a formidable holdout for the traitors. And though much of it had fallen into disrepair following the destruction of Nostramo, it was still expected to be a tough fight. The Blood Angels dispatched infiltrators, approaching the moon by stealth in the darkness of the void and forcing remote airlocks, but what they found was a station deserted. While the outer station was undamaged, the corridors and loading bays bore the scars of small arms fire, consistent not only with Legion weaponry, but also with the oldest relic versions of Legion weaponry. Some walls bore scars consistent with a type of Volkite weapon issued to the very first Crusade forces. Corpses were everywhere, strewn through the corridors, piled behind obviously makeshift barricades, and concentrated in hangar bays, and they were all defenders, Night Lords and their auxilia, all in a state of decomposition that indicated that they had lain undisturbed for years, possibly more than a decade. Whoever had attacked the base had not only taken their casualties with them, but also stripped the station of anything of use. Hangars were emptied of craft and of support equipment, armories were bare, and even the progenoid glands had been harvested from all the dead Night Lords. The command spire of the base showed similar scars, including the headless corpse of a Night Lord's Praetor and the signs of forced access to Night Lord's deployment information, again accessed about a decade before. The Blood Angels force attempted to retrieve picked captures of what had happened, but very little of the data from the assault was still intact. The only sign as to who had attacked the base all those years ago was grainy picked captures of an unknown Astartes force, clad in the oldest marks of of Legion plate, painted black and red and with an unrecognisable symbol on the shoulder. At the time, this pointed towards a Black Shield force. Black Shields was a general name given to all the unknown and unnumbered Astartes forces that had become common during the latter days of the Heresy, as the two sides fractured into smaller and smaller fighting units. Many Astartes became disillusioned with the war for varying reasons. Some companies, particularly veterans of unification, stayed loyal to one side while their Primarchs sided with the other. Some were the remnants of scattered units who felt little kinship to either side, or for whom the Civil War destroyed any faith they had left in either. And some felt so slighted by the events of the Crusade or the Heresy that they struck out on their own. All of these units tended to remove their Legion heraldry and adopt new colours, or merely repainted their armour black, and they fought on both sides and on neither during the war. From their actions in Tenebor, it seemed that this particular Black Shield company were the latter sort. They were evidently no friends of the Night Lords, but their actions suggested renegades stealing supplies wherever they could. As Imperial forces pushed into the Nostramo sector, more strange discoveries were made. On Cairn, an industrial world that was a manufacturing hub for the 8th Legion, an expedition sent by the rogue trader Erasmus Scathe found the hive cities of the planet toppled, their rubble sealing the subsurface levels. When the rogue trader's troops forced entry in the hope of recovering the valuable STC systems at the heart of Cairn's industrial might, they found only ransacked data vaults and the devolved remains of the population, scavengers who'd been sealed in the subsurface levels and had devolved into cannibalism. Pict's records showed a similar culprit, a force of Astartes in ancient marks of battleplate, red and black in colour, and covered in markings both familiar and unknown. The Terran Raptor and Thunderbolt, the symbol of those who fought in the Unification Wars, was present, as well as other esoteric markings that seemed similar to gang symbols, as well as numerous talismans and trophies, weapons claimed in battle, Xenos claws and amulets made of something that looked like pale green jade. These invaders had led a serious operation of salvage, thoroughly ransacking the data vaults of the hives of anything of value before deliberately collapsing them and trapping the inhabitants below within the rubble. The rogue traders' forces were lucky to escape the tombs with their lives. And then later, in year 31 of M41, the same Blood Angels force, newly christened the Angels Vermilion chapter in the wake of the Second Founding and the breaking up of the Old Legions, discovered another relic of the same marauding force, the wreck of the Night Lord's vessel Shroud of Eventide on Caleth. Raising the wreck for salvage, they discovered the remnants of logs entered by the vessel's former commander, Chiron Ophion of the Chiroptera. Ophion was the captain of the Night Lord's 39th Company, a strangely honourable and brave warrior, certainly for a Night Lord, who had fought with distinction throughout the Thramas Crusade against the Dark Angels, before returning to Nostramo at the head of 9,000 Legion warriors, intending to rally what Legion assets were still there. Of course, he was nowhere to be found. But as well as confirming the fractured state of the 8th Legion in the wake of the Heresy, Ophion's logs described rumours of a marauding force of Astartes originating in the Akom-Sothos cluster and burning their way through the Nostramo sector. The Shroud of Eventide and its attendant vessels were then ambushed by the unknown fleet and forced to make planetfall, where they were presumably wiped out by their attackers. In that report, Ophion referred to their enemy as the last survivors of a fallen legion, and to intercepted communications that finally result in a name, the Ashen Claws. Imperial records, of course, couldn't totally identify if that name meant anything anymore, partly because the Raven Guard Legion had deleted any mention of the Ashen Claws way before in the Great Crusade. And so the Angels Vermilion fleet moved on, rechristening the salvage ship the Crimson Intent and claiming it as a prize, towing it to the nearby forge world of Golgorad for refit as part of their new chapter fleet. But a few years later, an even more certain source was uncovered following the discovery of logs from the latter part part of the Heresy War, made by the 10th chapter of the Ultramarines while engaging a powerful Night Lord's force over the planet of Desperation at the Corewood edge of the Nostramo sector. The Night Lord's fleet, having outmaneuvered the Ultramarines and their invasion forces on the surface pinned down by pre-planned Night Lord's ambushes, the Ultramarines Legion had seriously lost the initiative when a fleet of unknown Imperial craft hove into the system. Refusing to respond to hails, the new fleet, consisting of 6 capital ships and a slew of older escort craft, engaged the Night Lords in a withering crossfire. When the Ultramarine commanders attempted to establish contact with their unknown allies, they received a curt response, transmitted across all audio channels by a commander who named themselves Praetor Kareen. The Emperor consigned us to the care of a tyrant who sought to see us dead and forgotten. Now the Raven Lord himself is dead, we care not to see the collar of servitude clasped round our necks once more, neither in service to the turncoat Warmaster or to a failed empire. And with that, the newcomers deployed their own landing craft, aiming for Desperation's primary armories, and launched a series of hit-and-run assaults against the Ultramarines who currently held it. The ferocious assault forced out the Ultramarines' units, and the Ashen Claws quickly established a defensive perimeter while a stream of shuttlecraft ransacked the Armorium, leaving the Ultramarines to face continued attack from roving Night Lords terror squads still active on the surface. When Ultramarines destroyers of the Nemesis Company finally forced a breakthrough of the Ashen Claws lines, the Black Shields just fell back to orbit with the last of their haul. Only one final official record exists of the company, from a long-range Imperial patrol who intercepted astropathic messages, potentially years old, at the outer edges of the Ghoul Stars decades later in 063 M31. Fourth Company reports the asteroid settlements of the Orcades brought into compliance as per the edicts of the Second Crusade, 1,000 souls claimed as bondsmen for the Legion, that it may grow and prosper. Expect our return to Atagartis within the month for reassignment. Many of the Black Shield forces of the Heresy era were rounded up in the years following it. Some to be destroyed for serving the interests of the Warmaster, some to be brought back into the fold, hastily reassigned as a new chapter of the Second Founding to shore up the Imperium's defences. But the Ashen Claws were one of the few Black Shield forces to remain independent, falling back to their new homeworld of Atagartis in the Ghoul Stars. It seems that, for at least a time, they engaged in some semblance of empire building, increasing their numbers by utilising gene seeds stolen from the worlds of Nostramo, as well as other more dubious sources. But as the long millennia passed, this seems to have fallen into decline, as the Ashen Claws became little more than a band of renegades. Atagartis was the perfect base for this. Eons before, 2 of its planets had collided, leaving the system strewn with shards of dead rock and blasted by radiation, the perfect haven for a pirate stronghold, especially for people as hardy as Astartes. And so the Claws built their new home, the lost Eyrie on the world of Atagartis Prime, dominating the renegades and void tribes that infested the system. The Ashen Claws do not consider themselves traitors, like those legions who sided with Horus, as to them their only loyalty was to their brothers. They're loyal to the Ashen Claws, just like they've always been loyal to the Ashen Claws. And for 10 millennia, their fleet has plagued the space lanes of their Dark Empire, taking merchant ships and their cargo on occasion, protected by their placement within the dangerous Ghoul Stars. But by the 41st millennium, that renegade chapter has significantly decreased in power, their holdings limited to the areas of space around Atagartis, and their resources and manpower bled by long millennia as outcasts, exiles cowering on the edge of existence, afraid to ever step back in the light, afraid to take up arms and perform the deeds their kind were bred for. Their existence is now all but forgotten, but there are a few chapters still within the fold of the Imperium who do remember them, particularly their cousins in the Carcharodon Astra, who seem likely to have shared a similar origin as part of the ancient Terran 19th, exiled to a nomad predation fleet millennia before. While the two forces have never been on completely friendly terms, and meetings between them often descend into ridicule or ritualized combat, they still trade for war material, resources, and gene seed when necessary, and have even been known to come to each other's aid at times. Life on the fringes of the galaxy is hard, and their fleets have sometimes been called on to prevent one or the other from final extinction. But apart from those few ties, the Ashen Claws of 40k seem to be a shadow of their former selves, a relic of the distant past, forgotten about in the darkness and chaos of the universe, and slowly destroyed not by any crusade or particular push to unseat them, but simply by time. Without the patronage of the Dark Gods and the support networks of Chaos, or those of the Imperium, and able to exist only on the meagre resources of radiation-soaked worlds in a storm-racked part of the galaxy, whatever plans they seem to have had for empire building eventually fell by the wayside, until they were just another force of pirates, an anomaly that took 10,000 years to finally disappear. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to support the channel, well, why not visit the new merch store linked below or at arbiturian.com and proclaim your allegiance to the law, or join the Patreon or YouTube membership scheme where you can get early access to videos, ask questions on the book club, or join in with Tale of Four Gamers on our Discord. All of those are available at various different levels of membership. Details in the thing below. See ya!